Introduction. On April 15th, 1947, my father, Jack Roosevelt Robinson, stepped out of the Brooklyn Dodgers dugout, crossed first base, and assumed his position as first baseman. He paused, hands resting on bent knees, toes pointed in, then stood, lifted his cap, and saluted the cheering fans. It was a defining moment for baseball and for America. As a result of Dad's accomplishments on and off the field, I inherited a legacy of excellence and service. Today, this legacy takes me into classrooms across the United States, Canada, and the Caribbean. As the Vice President of Educational Programming for Major League Baseball, I bring the Breaking Barriers program into schools where children, ball players, and I talk baseball, values, and books. The kids are naturally curious about my childhood. They want to know what was it like being Jackie Robinson's daughter. They ask me questions such as, did your dad come home angry after losing a baseball game? Or, how did you and your family feel about the hate letters you got? But the question that makes me stop and think hardest has been, did you really know your father? When kids ask me that question, I tell them, I was 6 when my dad retired from baseball, 12 when he was elected into the Hall of Fame, 22 when he died. I also tell the children that my father taught me to flip pancakes, hit a baseball, question political leaders, solve problems, and keep promises. Whether I was learning to walk, wildly swinging the bat at a fastball, tackling one of my brothers during a football game, or singing a show tune from West Side Story on the rock ledge of our fireplace, Dad encouraged me with his praise and loving smile. At times, my father made me feel like I was the most important person in his life. He was fond of saying, just put your fingertip in my tea and I won't need any sugar. I'd giggle and believe I actually had the power to sweeten that cup. When I was sad, Dad was there for me. The first time I cried over failed love, he sat on my bed and reminded me that I deserved better. Over the years, I've learned about my father's baseball days from friends, family, other ball players, and even strangers who are anxious to share cherished Jackie Robinson memories with me. To this day, I'm mesmerized by newsreels of my dad rounding the bases, joyously clapping his hands as he outfoxes another pitcher. My dad was famous. My brothers and I grew up among awards, trophies, and photographs, but our parents taught us not to worship these honors. They said we should measure our lives by the impact we had on other people's lives. All we had to do was pay attention to the way our parents lived to know that this was true. As a kid, my favorite photograph hung on the wall leading to the lower level of our house. It showed my dad stealing home plate during the 1955 World Series. I passed it several times a day and always paused to look at how a cloud of dirt obscured half my dad's body, or to study the way his right hand was clenched into a fist. I never failed to notice how my dad's face twisted with fierce determination. Could this be the same man who never raised his voice at home? Looking back, I realized that one of the things I admired most about my father was how he stayed in the game until the end. He stood firm even when his opinion wasn't popular. Whether questioning an umpire or an American president, Dad used his celebrity to challenge an unjust system and support a movement organized to correct the wrongs. So yes, I knew my dad well as a father and as a man. This brings me to why I wrote Promises to Keep. Though my father's story has been told many times, I wanted the opportunity to tell it in its fullness. Promises to Keep is more than a photographic biography. It's a story about commitment. I've chronicled my father's life through words and pictures as a lasting memory to a man who was shaped by American history and who had an impact on American history. As you read Promises to Keep, you'll see that my father's personal and professional experiences, like baseball itself, reflected the American experience of his time. A lifetime of service was my father's commitment to America and his challenge to you. Whether you commit to study hard, to be a better friend, family member, or neighbor, I hope that through my father's example, you will understand why making a promise and keeping it is so important. The caption under the picture says, "My Dad and Me." A black and white world. My great-grandparents were slaves. My grandmother was a sharecropper. My father was born into a segregated world. Although it may be hard for you to imagine an America where black and white people were kept apart by laws and customs, that world existed. My father helped change it. By breaking the color barrier in Major League Baseball, my father helped break down racial segregation. Before we get into the story of Jackie Robinson, however, we need to understand how segregation became a way of life in the United States. The story of race relations in the United States begins more than 400 years ago when African men, women, and children were enslaved and forcibly brought to the American colonies. The Civil War, 1861 through 65, ended this terrible, inhumane practice. By 1870, there were approximately 4 million African Americans in the United States who, because of the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution, were now U.S. citizens. As freed men and women, some former slaves attended school for the first time, farmed in a system called sharecropping, voted and held local, state, and federal offices. But the new freedoms granted to African Americans were unacceptable to many Southern whites who were used to being in control. These Southerners used political, legal, and violent means to control blacks. They passed state laws to restrict the rights of blacks and to keep them from voting. Even the courts denied blacks opportunities and basic human rights. In Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, the United States Supreme Court upheld a state's right to pass racial segregation laws. The Supreme Court's ruling said that such laws did not violate the United States Constitution. The nation was divided, those favoring segregation against those who opposed it. The period of legal segregation in America is commonly referred to as the Jim Crow era. In the 1830s, Thomas Rice, a famous white music hall entertainer in Baltimore, Maryland, created a fictional character based on a black singer-dancer. Rice called his character Jim Crow. White audiences laughed at the clowning and foolish antics of the character. Black people found the performances demeaning. They began to use the term Jim Crow to mean discrimination. Okay, let's look at some of the pictures. Here is the slave quarters taken around 1860 to 63. 1619, people kidnapped from Africa are brought to the Virginia colony. In 1776, there are approximately 2 million slaves in the American colonies. After the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, approximately 55,000 free black people live in what is now the United States. 1787. The U.S. Constitution does not mention slavery, but it does ban the importation of slaves as of 1808. That means after 1808, no more slaves could be brought into the United States. 1861 to 65. The Civil War rages between the Union, the North, and the Confederacy, the South. Here is a picture of this 19th century sheet music shows a Jim Crow figure. Notice that the song is sung by Thomas Rice in Ethiopian. Ethiopia is a country in Africa. So there's a picture of a song and a Jim Crow figure. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation, which frees slaves in the Confederate States. So after this date, all the slaves in the South and the North were now free. 1865. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution makes slavery illegal everywhere in the United States. So after this date, it was illegal or against the law for anyone to own a slave. 1868. The 14th Amendment guarantees all people born in the United States, including African Americans, citizenship and equal protection under the law. Native Americans are not included. 1870. The 15th Amendment grants all adult male citizens the right to vote. So from this date, all men were allowed to vote, even the African American men.